WPATH was not on trial at all, and their standards of care, their guidelines weren't really referred to specifically very often and were essentially largely put aside. So people who think that this entire trial or trials like these are going to be taking on the whole system are going to be in for a disappointment, because in fact, what they mostly do is they say, here's the benchmark, did you meet it? So whether you agree with the benchmark or not, or whether you agree with the types of practices that now are widely accepted, at least by a lot of physicians, even if you don't agree with them, did they even meet that standard? So you talk to some lawyers behind these cases, and a lot of them are conservative, and they really believe this entire pediatric medicine field should be blown off the map. They'll say, like, despite the fact that we think the WPATH guidelines are bunk, you didn't even meet them, and that's why we're suing you.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today, my guest is Benjamin Ryan. He's an independent reporter who has been covering pediatric gender medicine for the past 3 years, including on his Substack, benryan.substack.com. He writes for publications such as the New York Times, NBC News, and the New York Sun, and covered the Detransitioner trial for the Free Press. Today, we're going to talk about the historic Varian versus Einhorn case, the first case in the world of a detransitioner lawsuit succeeding. Which Ben Ryan was the only he was the only journalist present for the whole trial, so he's got that.
Right. There was one other guy there for part of the time, so yeah.
Well, welcome to the show, Ben. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
So I offered a little civil, transparent dialogue up front because I know we have different policies about how we communicate. And as longtime listeners of this show know, I do not insist on having everything in common with my guests. That would be boring. And frankly, I would have no guests because there's nobody I agree with everything on.
Yeah.
So we do civil discourse here. I personally use biologically accurate pronouns because I don't believe in gender ideology at all. Ben, what would you like to say about your personal stance on those issues?
In this case, it doesn't really matter because in the trial, it was a little complicated because the plaintiff identifies as a woman now, but there were periods of time when she used they, them, or he, him, or in a different name. So sometimes they would be switching names and pronouns. But in general, the overarching narrative, they use she, her pronouns. But I tend to use people's preferred pronouns. I think maybe an exception would be if there was someone convicted of a sex crime or something. In that case, I'd be like, fine. But in another case, I try to be respectful of how people want to be presented, that kind of thing.
Okay. And, I've been following your work for a while, and I know you're kind of a polarizing figure amongst the gender critical community because you are a journalist who is, you kind of defined what your role is. And I think you're a little too woke for the gender critical people and too gender radical for the woke people. So,
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I try to go down the middle just intellectually from a place of circumspection, and nobody's neutral. We all have our biases, and there is what you choose to say, what you don't choose to say that can reveal a certain bias, certain focus. But I do my best to withdraw myself from the story as much as possible. Just try to be respectful, just say what happened without being inflammatory, that kind of thing. So, which isn't to say necessarily that being gender critical or woke is by definition inflammatory, but I just try to peel away from those polarities, and just hopes that people will take me out of the story and listen to what this story actually is.
I respect people.
Hopefully it's not about me.
I respect people who have principles that they can clearly articulate and try to stick to. And I've been following your work because it's too important. I know some people on my gender critical side of the issue really don't like you, and you've blocked them for being rude to you.
Being rude. If they're not civil, I'm like, you're out of here. I don't need this anymore. So.
But here's the thing: you have this important role in doing your due diligence as a reporter on this trial, which somehow has not made it big in the news yet, but it's a really big deal.
Well, the reason why there were only 2 journalists there is you had to have been clued in. So somebody told me about it long in advance. And I was the only one who knew about it. They could have chosen to tell other people they didn't. And so it was just sitting there, some files, buried within some government website. So I have all the case files, but then the judge, for whatever reason, put them under seal when he started the case. And then he's kept all the transcripts from the trial under seal as well. So there's no other way for the information to get out. And the only reason there was another journalist there for part of the time is because I foolishly, for my own purposes, undermined my own purposes. I was tweeting about it, and he followed the breadcrumbs and showed up, and I was so irritated. So just being competitive or whatever. But that's why it happened. It's not a conspiracy of any kind of omission that there weren't other journalists there. But there is the question of like, okay, well, why am I only hearing from like right wing podcasts who want me to go on this week and tell them what happened? Why is the mainstream media not digesting my piece? They might, my free press article only right now when we're speaking came out a few hours ago, so we'll see. But that's a general trend you see where the right wing media is very eager to report on this, especially if there's a big headlines that they see as at least salacious, whereas the other side is much more cautious, shall we say?
So this case sort of snuck up on people. Like all of a sudden, the Fox versus Varian case, we hear about this victory. We didn't hear much leading into it. And as you mentioned in your free press article, there are almost 30 detransitioner lawsuits. This is the first to achieve a victory. Some have met statute of limitation issues, but why is there such a difference between the Fox variance case, excuse me, the Fox variant case and the more high profile lawsuits that we've all heard about, like Chloe Cole?
The main difference is the this personality and the desires of the plaintiff. She did not want to make a big thing of this. She's not political. I think it made for a much easier and cleaner case for her in court. She couldn't be accused of being some political pawn that never came up. There were no politics in the case. Whereas Chloe, gonna love her or hate her, has made a great spectacle of her case. They've decided to go all in on publicity. That's basically her job. She's supported by, some sort of conservative organizations, that sort of thing. So that's really it was really about what the plaintiff wanted. And I'm sure there were conversations with their lawyer of what would be a good strategy and that kind of thing. But on the stand, she made very clear that she was unhappy about publicity and that sort of thing. And unhappy. She didn't refer to me in particular, but I was only two journalists there that she was unhappy about press being there. So I think she just prefers her privacy.
And that's very understandable. She's lost so much at an early age. I
Yeah,
hear
it's a lot to
that.
put on.
Time to move forward now.
And she's 22 years old and just coming into her own. A lot of what the case was about is her trying to find herself. I'm in my late 40s at this point. I'm used to being attacked online. It's extremely scary. Yeah, I think when you have some experience with it, it passes. There's a bloom for a day or two, and then they find something else to talk about. But when you're in the middle of it, that can be really distressing to say the least. Especially, she's trying to be an actress, so thinking about her name going forward, I'm sure that that's difficult to think about. Having it be associated with something that you wouldn't want linked to your acting career necessarily.
So I'm going to share with our listeners part of why this is so close to home for me. I've been part of the gender critical online community for 5, 6 years now, and we've all been looking forward to the first detransitioner victory in court, and now we have it. And not only did she win the case, but the psychologist who signed off on her mastectomy was found by the jury to be 70% responsible.
Yes.
And as I looked into this further, I learned that that psychologist, Kenneth Einhorn, actually works for the company that bought out the company I used to work for. So, LifeStance Health is a national conglomerate that's been going around buying out these smaller group practices. And that happened to the practice I used to work for before I went into private practice. LifeStance bought out Western, like maybe within a year of my leaving Western. And LifeStance also bought out Carmel Psychological Associates, which is where Kenneth Einhorn was working when he treated Fox Varian and signed off on her mastectomy, which she came to regret. So this feels incredibly close to home for me.
Right. And you and I were talking about this just before we started taping, is that his actual practice, the company itself really didn't come up. There were no specifics during the trial about his company. It was just sort of a larger shell in which he worked. It was all about his doings.
And I have some thoughts on that as a therapist who has worked in a group practice, but I'll save those thoughts for I'll save those thoughts for later in the conversation. Right now, I'd like to dive into the case and just have you tell our listeners, especially those who haven't heard of this before, what the Varian versus Einhorn case was and what the results were, and some about the process as well.
So Fox Varian, right now, she's 22 years old. She lives in the White Plains or Westchester County area, which is about 45 minutes north of New York City. And she had a really difficult childhood, a lot of different emotional problems, difficulty finding a school environment that worked for her, very complex educational needs. She was diagnosed with autism. Her parents had a very difficult and protracted custody battle over her. It started when she was 7 years old. She was estranged from her father ultimately. She had a major meltdown with her first period, which happened when she was about 12. And so then she started seeing a psychologist, Kenneth Einhorn, when she was 14 in 2017. And towards the end of 2018, she's about 15 and a half years old. She started to mention that she might be having thoughts about her gender, might want to change her name to something kind of androgynous. And then in quick succession between December 2018, January 2019, she got a breast binder, she cut her hair short, she changed her name to a more masculine name, Rowan, and then she started coming out publicly at school. So January 2019, that's the beginning of the real public phase of this rapid fire social transition. 2 months after that, March 2019, she first mentions to Einhorn that she thinks she might want to have top surgery. She might want to have a double mastectomy. And something that in the case, the plaintiff's attorney, Adam Deutsch, who's a local White Plains personal injury attorney, really harped on was that his case note from that first meeting in the middle of March of 2019 was not, we talked about top surgery and Florida or whatever, was something about taking action, of looking into how to get top surgery. So that was a real indictment on Einhorn of this idea of why didn't you explore and talk about and even question it? Not say, I'm an authority figure, therefore you should not do it. You know very well, obviously, that's not a way that psychology tends to work unless it's, I'm going to go out and murder somebody. So after that, March into October, Einhorn writes a letter of referral to a plastic surgeon. And then 2 months after that, the plastic surgeon, after having two meetings uh, with Arian, he removes her breasts. So the letter itself, that was a real clincher in the case as well. It was pretty flawed. There were errors in it. There were errors of omission. And also, for example, he said, oh, she's doing well and better with her anxiety, as evidenced by her school attendance. The thing is, she was always in and out of different schools, and she'd been in one program the previous school year, but he had just noted the previous months in his case notes that she wasn't in regular schooling in the fall of 2019. So that was wrong. He left out diagnoses she had, which Deutsch argued were not under control. That was never quite established whether they were or weren't, but he argued that. And critically and oddly, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is pretty widely accepted as the requirement for having top surgery, for top surgery is ostensibly a treatment for that condition. That diagnosis was not in the letter. Oddly, he wrote body dysmorphic disorder. What she claimed in a deposition, and this part didn't come up in the trial, was for insurance purposes, which doesn't make any sense to me because gender dysphoria is often covered by insurance for these types of surgery, whereas body dysmorphic disorder, as anyone as you well know, is a contraindication for plastic surgery. For people who don't know body dysmorphic disorder, do you want to define it?
Sure. And I'll define it with this caveat that I believe the DSM is a very political document. It's
I
shaped
agree.
pharmaceutical industry, it's affected by culture. So personally, I think of gender dysphoria as a bogus diagnosis that points to a combination of things, which oftentimes there's a ton of overlap with body dysmorphic disorder, which has to do with an obsessive misperception of and discomfort with the appearance and form of one's body. Where do you draw the lines between something like that, gender dysphoria, obsessive compulsive disorder? Go ahead, Ben.
This was a real dispute between the expert witnesses as well, whether those two things are totally distinct or whether they can or might overlap, and if they did overlap in this case. So this Lauren Schechter, he is the head of the gender affirming surgery program at Rush University in Chicago. He's the president-elect of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, the very influential, I call it quasi-activist medical organization. He testified on behalf of the plaintiff, which has really surprised a lot of people because they're saying, wait a minute, the WPATH guy was testifying on behalf of the plaintiff. But what he said was he was looking at the case file, at all the depositions, trying to find exculpatory evidence. He didn't use that word, um, mind you, about Dr. Chin. He couldn't find it in the end. He decided that Dr. Chin in particular was very much at fault. He was there to judge Chin's performance because he was a plastic surgeon. But what he said about the letter, Dr. Schechter, was that, to your point, it's very concerning if you're suggesting that somebody has body dysmorphic disorder about the specific body part that you want to operate on, that is a major red flag. he called a stop sign, he said. He said that Dr. Chin absolutely was required under the standard of care for his practice to have called Dr. Einhorn to say, what's up with this? Let's clarify this. What did you mean? But Dr. Chin was very defensive and said, no, there were all these other inferences in there, suggestions that she did have gender dysphoria because there were seven different points he made. See, he's saying this, that's this, and this. Those all define gender dysphoria. Therefore, it was fine for me to assume that she did and to go ahead with the surgery. But neither Dr. Chin nor Dr. Einhorn, despite seeing her for several years, ever wrote gender dysphoria anywhere in any of their case notes. Dr. Chin wrote breast hypertrophy in his notes, which speaks to a larger theme that we see in gender medicine, where doctors and psychologists or psychiatrists will put in a diagnosis code, such as, say, endocrine disorder not otherwise specified, as opposed to gender dysphoria, to try to get insurance coverage, or maybe, allegedly in some cases to get around laws that ban these types of treatments. But the breast hypertrophy is used to justify a breast reduction for somebody who has breasts that are too large for whatever reason, and they may have back pain or maybe it's cosmetic, to justify that surgery. So, maybe if Dr. Chen had called Dr. Einhorn and squared away this question, oh, I meant her dysphoria, that would have cleared it up. But also, the big question was also then might they have had some more in-depth discussions of her problems, whether she was ready for this, and crucially, what kind of expertise Dr. Einhorn actually had in this field, because Dr. Chen never asked and Dr. Einhorn never offered what sort of experience or expertise he had in caring for these types of patients.
All right, I'm going to give some comments. First of all, Dr. Eitan and I talked about this diagnosis of breast hypertrophy that has
Mhm.
been used in medical billing fraud uh, to cover a completely different procedure, right? There's a difference between a breast reduction and a breast removal. So a breast reduction preserves mammary glands, for instance, and breast removal does not. But Dr. Heim explains in that interview why we see this medical billing fraud happening to cover treatment, especially for minors. And a related interview I'll refer listeners to as well as the one I had around the same time with Dr. Travis Morrell. Um, Second of all, I wanna just give my commentary on how absurd it is that this, so-called standard or guideline exists anywhere, that if the patient has what a clinician labels body dysmorphic disorder, that should be a red flag. But if they have what is labeled gender dysphoria, that should be a green flag. There
Yeah,
is
yeah.
no I'm expressing my own opinion. You don't have to agree with me, but my opinion, which I'm expressing on my show, is that is ridiculous. And yet, it's so interesting that the fact that WPATH makes that distinction resulted in what, the president of WPATH? The who?
President-elect. I think he starts at the end of the year. They're 2-year terms, so he would start, I think, in November, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, the president-elect of WPATH testified on behalf of the plaintiff in this case, and that is just such a double-edged sword because, one of the questions I saw coming in for you, and I might be kind of jumping ahead of myself here, but when I posted on X, "Hey, I'm interviewing Ben Ryan about this article. What questions do you guys have?" This was one of the issues that people brought up. Like, does the case make it look like WPATH guidelines are bogus in the first place, or does it make it look like WPATH guidelines weren't followed?
Well, importantly, that wasn't really up for question. So it was very interesting because at the time, WPATH's guidelines, they were in their seventh edition. I think it came out in 2012. Right now, it's in the eighth edition, came out in 2022. So we're referring to an antiquated edition in the first place. But both the defendants were very eager to say that they said that the WPATH guidelines were not the standard of care. And I'm going to have to say also, for those of you who know what the actual title of the WPATH guidelines are, they're confusingly called the standards of care. So the plaintiff's attorney very cleverly never told the jury this until later on for fear of confusing them. But the judge at one point, he was kind of a funny guy. We're all going to lunch and he's like, this is so crazy and annoying that they call this document the standards of care. What were they thinking? So in any case, they both said the WPATH guide, let's call them guidelines to try not to confuse people, were not the legal standard of care, because the question for the case itself was, did you deviate from the standard of care, or would a reasonable physician or psychologist would do in the circumstances. So, in that sense, WPATH was not on trial at all, and their standards of care with the big S, big C, their guidelines weren't really referred to specifically very often, and were essentially largely put aside. So, people who think that this entire trial or trials like these are going to be taking on the whole system are going to be in for a disappointment because, in fact, what they mostly do is they say, "Here's the benchmark. Did you meet it?" So whether you agree with the benchmark or not, or whether you agree with the types of practices that now are widely accepted, at least by a lot of physicians, even if you don't agree with them, did they even meet that standard? So you talk to some lawyers behind these cases, and a lot of them are conservative. They really believe this entire pediatric medicine field should be blown off the map. They'll say, like, despite the fact that we think the WPATH guidelines are bunk, you didn't even meet them, and that's why we're suing you.
Yeah. Gosh, I have so many thoughts and feelings. I can't tell what's what. I really feel
One thing I want to add, though,
go
not to
ahead.
interrupt, sorry.
Mhm.
However, I just found out there's a caveat. So Chloe Cole, the most famous detransitioner, and Kayla Lovedahl, represented by the same firm, their cases do add, in addition to what I said, they also add, and we think WPATH is bunk. I don't know how well that'll work in a medical malpractice case. We'll see. That's more ambitious. But I've counted 28 of these cases, including the variant, the Einhorn. And let's see, that would make 24 of them seem to be more straight medical malpractice cases that don't go after the system. There are two additional that are civil rights cases that interestingly accuse LGBTQ community clinics of violating the civil rights of gay men for not discerning that they had internalized homophobia and misinterpreting that they were transgender and had gender dysphoria and then putting them through a vaginoplasty and other transition treatments. So those are also very interesting and ambitious cases. We'll see how they fare.
Very interesting. So I wonder about the strategic choice to downplay the role of WPATH, and there's so many layers to this. So one, there's the manipulation of words that WPATH essentially does whatever it wants, calls the guidelines they come up with, which are not rooted in science. They call them the standards of care, not to be confused with the legal definition of standards of care,
Except
right?
that it is very confusing.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very I mean, it's like, I mean, and here's where I'm expressing my opinion, which may vary from yours, Benjamin, but my belief is like just because a person identifies as something doesn't make them that. Yeah, but
Yeah.
the transgender ideology is founded on this idea that you can identify as whatever you want. So WPATH identifies as leading experts. They identify as creating what they think are the standards of care. They identify whatever they want. It doesn't mean that what they say is true. It's just manipulation of language. So I think it's very
Mhm.
interesting that this case made a distinction between the classic definition of standards of care, what were considered the best practices for someone in this profession treating someone with this issue in terms of how to proceed. They're differentiating that from the WPATH standards of care, but also kind of downplaying WPATH.
Well, it was a defense strategy that they were downplaying it because, what the plaintiff attorney is going to try to get them to do and did in many cases is going to say, are these the standards of care? And then let's say they say yes. Therefore, we agree that because you already agreed that you did X, Y, and Z, you deviated from the standards of care. If they're just going to say there are no standards, when what they said explicitly, both the defendants, they said there is no standard of care, period, in this field because for mastectomies for minors because it's so new and experimental. So that seemed like a defense strategy. I don't know necessarily that they believe all of those strings of words together, but it made it harder to pin them on actually doing anything. The one really concrete thing that they actually said, both of them, was that they thought that gender identity should be stable for at least 6 months prior to surgery. And they ultimately learned because so Einhorn realized the limitations of his experience and recommended to his patient and her mother that they go seek specialist care from this place called the Pride Center in Albany. It was 2 hour drive away, and she saw them twice. But while she was there, she was apparently more comfortable at being frank about her inner feelings and her ambivalence. She said she was lost. She said she wasn't sure about her gender identity. And then crucially, she said that she felt pressure to settle on a gender identity by the people around her. And then she was afraid of telling this to her mother. So Einhorn never asked for the notes from those sessions. He never learned this. And therefore, Dr. Chin never learned it. And Dr. Chin said, had he known this, it had happened only 4.5 months prior to the surgery that she told the Pride Center this, that he wouldn't have done this surgery. That said, the the jury wasn't convinced about this particular line of attack, and they said it didn't lead to her injury, but it was a major focus of the trial. And there were a couple cases like this where Chin was very happy to throw Einhorn under the bus and just to say, I didn't know. It was his responsibility to tell him. And how, it wasn't incumbent upon me to find out this information. He was supposed to offer it. So, whereas Einhorn didn't try to throw Chin under the bus at all. And he might have, but he didn't.
So tell us about some of the more disturbing things that were revealed about Einhorn's treatment of Varian.
Well, her mother, Claire Deacon, she's a practical care nurse, which means that she cares for chronically ill people in their homes. And they were always trying to pin her of having this great medical experience, therefore she could discern left from right when it came to the care of her daughter. And she was saying, like, no, I don't have a lot of experience in navigating the care system because I work in people's homes. In any case, she would get on the stand. She was very demure, quiet, sort of teary-eyed, upset. It's hard to be on the stand and be scrutinized like that. But when she remembered in vivid detail Einhorn, how she characterized as browbeating her into consenting to the surgery she didn't want for her child with threats of suicide, like she was unleashed. Her voice got much louder, and she would reenact these scenarios where one in particular, he said to her, she quoted, "You're not in reality, mom," where he was saying to her, almost yelling, she said, that she needed to come into his sense of seeing and the way he saw things and say that she was going to probably kill herself if she didn't have this surgery. So the idea was that he coerced her into consenting with this constant threat that her child was at very high likelihood of surgery. And then Dr. Schechter,
Of
her
suicide, you
friend,
mean?
yes,
The child with a
um,
high likelihood of suicide.
suicide, yes. So Dr. Schechter comes in and says, mastectomies are not a treatment or prevention for suicide, period. So let's just wipe that off the map. And, he didn't go into greater detail. He kind of didn't have to. But the reality is that research, at least into cross-sex hormones, there's one study that's ever looked at this directly. It was about all this nationalized health data in Finland. And they didn't find that there was any independent, statistically significant association between having taken cross-sex hormones and not, and suicide death. And they were able to compare this between youth who had gone to a gender clinic and compared to age match controls in Finland. So, and indeed, young people with gender dysphoria have a higher risk of suicide, but it's still a very rare outcome. So you'll see that these practitioners like Joanna Olson-Kennedy, who's a very famous gender care provider for California, would routinely tell her parents that if they were wary, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? But there's no science to back this. And it really implies that your chances are like 1 in 2 or something, as opposed to it being still a rare outcome. And what the Finnish study found was that they were using having been to a gender clinic as a proxy for gender dysphoria or transgender identity. And then they used specialist psychiatric appointments as a proxy for severe mental illness, because in Finland, seeing a specialist psychiatrist means you have a very severe mental illness. And they found that elevated suicide death rate was only independently associated with seeing the specialist psychiatrist and not independently associated with having gone to the gender clinic. And there's been a lot of debate of whether they're sort of like controlling out, they're controlling for something they're actually looking for in that. And I think those are worthy debates. But nevertheless, the only study to even try to look at this couldn't find evidence to support what these claims make.
Well, that matches what we know from other sources as well about suicide risk and transgender identity, which is that it's pretty much matched with the comorbidity level. And that for those who medicalize, the rate goes up over time. And we can see why, because of the complications. Even if there's no subjective report of regret, there are lifestyle complications that take away a person's coping and protective factors. Now, you said something in your article about the timing of when suicidal ideation actually emerges in the clinical record, and I thought this was quite significant. Could you go over that piece?
So Fox variant, and the specifics of this didn't entirely come up in the case, but they were in the deposition where her mother said in her deposition a couple years ago was that Fox would often threaten to kill herself about all sorts of things. This was a frequent theme with her daughter. And this clearly she was a very caring and devoted mother. So this is not to say that she didn't care, but she didn't take it seriously enough to think she was really going to do it. However, when Einhorn came in and he said that she would, then she felt compelled to take it seriously. He was an expert. He was a grown up.
Is it true? Maybe I'm misremembering your article. I thought that I read that Einhorn didn't document the patient expressing
Right. That's
suicidal
what it was.
ideation
Yes.
until after these conversations where he used
That's
that
right.
as a threat to her mother.
Yes. So Einhorn testified that in fact he did not believe that Varian was at a serious risk of suicide attempt before the surgery, despite the fact that constantly telling her mother that she was at very high risk of suicide. And, he had lots of ways of saying of why he wrote his notes the way he did, and it was only to jog my memory and that kind of thing. But when pressed, he did say that if something was very important, it was incumbent upon him to write it down. And he never noted any suicidal ideations prior to the surgery. Not that she didn't have them, but it suggested that they weren't serious enough to warrant a note. The first time he ever noted suicidality was after the surgery. And her mother says that she got worse after the surgery. And it wasn't until after the surgery that she started self harm, that she started cutting herself.
Many of you listening to this show are concerned about an adolescent or young adult you care about who's caught up in the gender insanity and therefore at risk of medical self-destruction. I developed ROGD Repair as a resource for parents just like you. It's a self-paced online course and community that will teach you the psychology concept and communication tools the families I've consulted with have found most helpful in understanding and getting through to their children, even when they're adults. Visit rogdrepair.com to learn more about the program and use promo code SOMETherapist2025 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com. I need to speak here as a clinician who's worked for a group practice similar to the one he worked for. There's an obligation to assess suicide risk factors from day one with any patient seeking treatment. And, and sometimes that's just as straightforward as patient reports having never had any suicidal ideation whatsoever. And so we can just kind of skip over that because it's, they're here for a family conflict or they're here for anxiety or something like that, right? Sometimes it's very brief. But if there's any indication that there's been, any passive or historical or mild suicidal ideation, there is a certain kind of due diligence that the clinician is expected to do and to document. So it seems very outside of the ordinary for suicide to have come up so much in the conversations with the mom, but not be documented at all. Talk about standards of care. That's not standard of care.
And, of course, there are different tiers of suicide risk. Are you just thinking about it abstractly? Do you have a plan? Have you gotten implements with which you're going to carry out the plan? That sort of thing. That level of risk of how much do we need to hospitalize you? That kind of thing. So, those various tiers certainly came up in the trial from various experts and from the defendants.
So what else was really striking about this case? You were there for the whole thing.
I do think that the plaintiff's attorney did quite a good job. His summation was pretty devastating because he hung the defendants on their own words and on their expert witnesses' own words. So, one by one, he was able to get people to admit they deviated from the standard of care or get their expert witnesses to say so. And there was one in particular where, it was a question of was Chin, somehow obligated to have gotten the information about this patient that she had waffled in the past on her gender identity? Should he have reached out and tried to obtain more information? And Joseph Serletti has a similar job at Penn Medicine to Joseph Schechter, so they were pretty equivalent in that regard. They both very well experienced, although Serletti didn't have the kind of direct academic experience in gender affirming medicine, as it's called, that Schechter did. But Serletti, he does these kind of surgeries all the time. He's done like 100 mastectomies, overwhelmingly on minors in the last few years. But he was rather dismissive of whether it really mattered, this relevant information about her waffling and her gender identity, whether that was crucial to the decision factor of going ahead with the surgery. And I thought this made a really interesting distinction because it was clear frankly, that he took less seriously a psychological issue that contributed to a surgery than he did to a medical one per se. And the way that Deutsch, the plaintiff's attorney, got this out of him, he said, okay, well, let's say there's a cardiologist specialist and he's seen one of your patients and something came up that he discovered that they have a risk factor that might be important for whether or not you decide to do a surgery that's related to cardiology and you don't know about it, but you go ahead with the surgery. Was that information not being passed to you a violation of the standard of care? And, he crumbled under it and said, yes. And therefore, Deutsch, the plaintiff's attorney, said, you would agree that in this similar circumstances, in this incumbent information for you to know about gender dysphoria and about the stability of this person's gender identity would be similar. And he ultimately said yes. And I thought that spoke to the fact that something that went unmentioned in the case, that in nowhere else in medicine currently do doctors change the body to treat the mind. Lobotomy, people did that, but especially on children, this is a totally unique ethical minefield, essentially, that they're in. And that's often not acknowledged. And it really spoke, and again, this wasn't addressed explicitly in the trial, to the difficulty of having a psychologist having to communicate with a plastic surgeon and vice versa, or if they don't communicate in this case, and trying to bridge those divides. And it doesn't work very well because, in some ways, the psychologist is being asked to act like a surgeon and approve surgeries in a certain way, and vice versa. A plastic surgeon is having to think like a psychologist, ask those kind of questions. And of course, plastic surgeons, they may be more used to this than, let's say, just a general surgeon because they have to ask questions that would, for example, figure out if someone had body dysmorphic disorder and they should reject them as a patient. But in this case, this system, which was an ad hoc system, just sort of thrown together by these people, sort of random associations with one another, the communication, it sort of broke down or didn't happen, and that hurt the patient.
Well, I hope I followed along with most of that. You do talk quite quickly.
Sorry.
But I think, you really brought it home there at the end, and this is the crux of the issue that myself and so many other gender critical people and conservative therapists are saying, that how on earth is it a mental health professional's job to recommend that a person modify their body? This is completely unprecedented, and maybe it would be one thing if there was a robust evidence base that the long-term psychiatric outcomes for people who did have body modifications were positive. But what in fact the long-term outcomes show are increased rates of suicide and increased rates of psychiatric drug use following these procedures. So there's really no precedent for making that judgment call whatsoever. And I remember when I was first put in a position as a therapist um to refer people to other therapists that were trained to write these letters. And I want to talk about that now because I want to talk about the group practice element and totally welcome you, Ben, to either, fill in where you have information that would help or to remain completely agnostic if I'm speaking to something that you don't want to express an
Yeah.
opinion on. But I want to voice this for my listeners, especially those in the helping professions and those who have loved ones dealing with this issue, um, which is that he did work for a group practice, and as you said, that's really been downplayed. And I couldn't exactly figure out the timeline because the practice that he worked for at the time was called Carmel Psychological Associates, but it got bought out by LifeStance Health, which, as I understand, is not run by therapists. It's run by people in the business of making money. And
Right.
I would imagine that, a company like LifeStance, which is just trying to run the business side of psychotherapy businesses around the country, would love to just stay out of something like this. But I think that this is forcing them into the spotlight. I understand that, Einhorn took the blame himself and did not, particularly refer to any, let's say, colleagues that he consulted with or trainings that he attended or company policies, but those are all the surrounding elements of any therapist working in a group practice. And when it comes to the idea of a standard of care, well, the standard of care more generally in psychotherapy, not pertaining to gender dysphoria in particular, is that when you're up against the limits of your knowledge base, you consult a colleague, you attend a training, or you refer to an expert. And I'm not sure if he did any of that. I'm hearing that he referred to the pseudo expert at the gender clinic, and that's what so many naive professionals do, including ones on the much more conservative side of this issue who just don't know better. Those who are, cautious and want to say, "Well, this isn't my area of expertise. Maybe you should go to talk to those gender experts over there." And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing because those gender experts over there are going to tell every single person that walks through their door, if you're having any doubts, yes, it means you're trans. So that's what he did. He referred her to a place where she went twice and somehow expressed more doubts in that setting than in the clinical setting. But I'm wondering about what was the environment? This is before COVID era lockdown. So therapy was in person, correct?
Yeah,
He's
eventually
in a building.
COVID happened and they stayed together, and so there was a talk about them being on Zoom and that sort of thing, but
Okay.
afterwards, obviously.
I remember what that was like, working in a building with colleagues next door. I remember the weekly meetings. I remember, the fact that you're supposed to kind of network and find out like who's good at what. And therefore, if you have a patient struggling with this thing that's at the edge of your knowledge base, who do you go talk to about that? And I'm really wondering about that side of things. Now, a lot of therapists are in private practice these days. It's kind of easier than ever doing things on Zoom. You don't have to pay for your own space to work in, but it leaves me wondering because I think companies like LifeStance are the ones that are going to have to be looking at cases like this and deciding what their company policies are. We had company policies at Western. We had a training that I went to circa 2017, which I've talked about many times on this show. Um, Still don't know who did the training. It might have been Laura Edwards Leeper for all I know. I don't remember, but this was where we were first introduced to a lot of what's considered the, sort of the WPATH standard of care, which isn't really the standard of care. This is where I was first introduced to the dead daughter, living son narrative. And I remember company policy, like, rapidly trying to keep up with the changing times at the same time as we had conservative leadership that is clearly had some doubts about it. I remember all of that going on. It was happening in a social context, and I'm wondering about the role of that social context in this case. I feel like it's been really downplayed.
Well, it didn't come up, so I have no answers to those questions whatsoever. The only thing that came up was just how those 2 businesses changed hands, when they bought out Carmel. But no, we never heard about any company policies, any of his colleagues, nothing like that. And in fact, the jury faulted him for not ensuring that Varian and her mother stuck with specialized trans care. So, again, to the point of this trial, they weren't there to say, they weren't there to agree with you in particular to say that no child should receive these types of interventions, but rather that there is a standard of care in which they do, and they were not followed. And in fact, one could argue, and that seemed to be the case, that had she stuck with the specialized trans care, that she might have felt more comfortable to explore herself more than it was happening with Einhorn, and then might have come to the resolution that she didn't want or need surgery. So, we'll never know, but that was at least in theory what might have happened, as evidenced by her being pretty candid right off the bat with the Pride Center in a way that it seems that she had not been with Einhorn. And, you know, I think there's a certain like emotional sunk cost you can imagine where even if you haven't engaged in any changes to your body, you've nevertheless told something about yourself. I mean, I remember being a kid and I was, I'd like sulk or something. And I'd kind of like, I'm kind of done sulking, but like I've committed to it. I'm embarrassed because if I stop, all of a sudden they'll realize it was inauthentic, you know? And I think that in a much more magnified orders of magnitude greater extent in these kind of cases is what it's like when you've gone around telling everyone what your name is. You've gotten upset with them if they misgender you. And if you go back and say, actually, I was mistaken, they'll be like, oh, why did you get so mad at me? So I'm going to go back and revise all those times that you indicted me and forgive myself retroactively. So I think perhaps one could theorize at least if that kind of some cost was going on with her mother and with Einhorn, where once she'd driven or ridden that train down that path. I kept using a train metaphor and who was driving it and during the trial. That it's a little hard to turn back because you kind of have to go back on your word in a way.
Well, you're getting into my territory now, Benjamin, talking about the sunk cost and the fragile adolescent ego, and that's all the kind of stuff that I teach parents about in my course, ROGD Repair. Uh, I teach parents how to anticipate those kind of reactions, plan for them, plan their approach differently to help their adolescent save face and not end up feeling like they have to dig their heels in because of their immaturity. But I think you raised a really important point here, which is how would this case have gone any differently if she had seen a so-called gender specialist? Because I'm hearing that there's kind of a narrative somewhere surrounding this case. I'm not sure if it's your narrative, someone else's narrative, but there is one narrative that says, well, maybe if she had seen people who truly specialized in gender care, she would have had more room to express her doubts and wouldn't have committed to this. But I find that really hard to believe because it's the people who work in the gender clinics and the people who specialize in gender care that are the diehard true believers. And they believe in things like I shouldn't gatekeep, for instance. And if you think you're trans, it means you're trans. So I'm curious, Benjamin, did the how would this have gone differently thing come up in court?
Oh, yes. So it was widely accepted, and no one really differed with this idea. Dr. Chin had said that there was only maybe a 1 to 4% regret rate with surgery, and Dr. Einhorn had said that 94% of people who transition stick with it. I don't agree with it. At least I know that those figures aren't reliable at the very least. So you can't hang your hat on that. I don't know where they got those numbers. There was the point where the defense attorneys thought that they knew where the numbers came from, and they made reference to a study that I then looked up and said, sure enough, it's from 2022. So no, that's not where the numbers came from in 2019. But let's just presume that that is a fact, that there's very low regret rate, and that's what Deutsch believed, the plaintiff's attorney. So in his closing summation, what he said was that the reason why nobody regrets anything in these other clinics that are highly resourced and everybody's communicating very well is is because they're following the standard of care, and in this case, they weren't. So, I mean, I don't think that that's a sound argument at all myself. I can say that certainly there's no science to back that up necessarily. And to your point, okay, well, let's take a look at the diehards, at the people who have run USPath or run WPATH. Joanna Olson-Kennedy, who has led the charge to disparage assessments, to say that they're worthless, they're counterproductive, that they're stigmatizing. There's a lawsuit against her, which was filed in December of 2024 by Clementine Green, that said this girl, she just similarly, she's 12 years old. She just started thinking about her gender recently. She walks into Joanna Olson-Kennedy's office. She's a pediatrician, mind you. She's not a mental health professional, and without doing any biopsychosocial assessment as recommended by WPATH, which she was the president of USPath the last couple of years, she didn't do any assessment and gave her puberty blockers as prescription on the first visit. And then she gave her testosterone when she was 13, signed off on her mastectomy when she was 14. So this is one of the biggest leaders in the field. And one could say that, there's a similar pattern here that's engaging in it a little bit differently, let's say. But if you dropped the same patient in the office of Joanna Olson-Kennedy, who's to say that she would have done anything different, or that she might have actually done it even faster for all we know? Right? Just want to say though that so Varian did not want testosterone. Einhorn talked about that with her, and there was sort of debate, is testosterone required before mastectomy? No, it isn't. Okay, fine. So that element was not a part of the case. She didn't take any puberty blockers or testosterone. She didn't want to. And then some people said, well, maybe that's indicative that she's really not meant to go through a medical transition if she doesn't want to really commit to it. And Einhorn was saying to her, not necessarily about you to take testosterone, but he was encouraging her to commit to her gender identity, and to do so as a way of convincing her mother, and owning her gender identity, using words like that. And so he was really indicted by, in particular, Erica Anderson, who's the transgender woman and the former head of USPath, who's become a real skeptic and a dissident out of the WPATH system. She's a psychologist, and she testified, really questioned, well, if she doesn't want to take testosterone, maybe this isn't right for her.
It seems like there's a big difference between that sentiment coming from Erica Anderson, of all people who I have honestly very little respect for personally. But that and the mainstream sentiment amongst gender ideologues, WPATH and all of that, which is this infinite range of gender expression, and that you can be non-binary, you can be anywhere on the spectrum. There's 82 different genders, right? And that you don't have to do one to do the other. And in fact, now they're making custom genitalia. Why should it look like male or female? Maybe it should look like a flower. I mean, that is part of gender ideology too. So for them to someone like Erica Anderson and WPATH to turn around and say that someone not going full bore, trans mask, the testosterone and the top surgery and the masculinization, and like for someone to say that someone not being fully on that path means that maybe this isn't right for them feels kind of like a change in narrative that just happens to protect them at the moment.
I mean, it definitely is a change in narrative because the studies that have largely established this field were based on a binary sense of sex and gender. So you transition from one to the other, and now kids are starting to identify as non-binary and gender fluid. And so some of them have been in these studies, and you see that in the Christina Olson study, and she was out of Princeton, that a certain percentage of them, Jesse Singal wrote about this for The Economist and on his Substack. I highly recommend those pieces, has switched to non-binary. And so that came up in this trial. The idea that his defense, when they were trying to argue that she hadn't been unstable in her trans identity, all that mattered was that she never said she wanted to be a woman or wanted to keep her breasts. So long as she was on a spectrum that didn't include being a woman, therefore she was stable in her gender identity. Didn't matter if it was non-binary or what pronoun she used. Therefore, she passed this 6-month threshold and therefore was fine for her to do the surgery. And I do want to say that, okay, so let's just say what you're saying here. So long as somebody is stable for 6 months in their gender identity, they can have the surgery as a minor. And there was a lot of talk of, ooh, it took her 3 years to say that she regretted the surgery. And that's a long time. So therefore, since it was a long period of time afterwards, the surgeon did his job. So what you're saying is you're arguing that under tort law, so long as there's a window just like this, and it starts here at the beginning of this year, and on the 6-month mark, she had the surgery. And then let's say through the end of the year after that, or maybe the middle of the year after that, she still felt that way. So long as that period exists, the surgeon is indemnified. And we're talking about a teenager. We're talking about a teenager, and as we all know, teenagers switch in and out of identities, what they want to do with their life, and how they were dressed, that kind of thing. So, is that a way to look at adolescence when we talk about concretizing these identity shifts? And I mean, the argument didn't seem to work, but they were indeed making that argument very clearly. And no one ever stepped out of it to say, that's kind of crazy to say that only 6 months is required because all the plaintiff's attorney needed was just one benchmark to say that they didn't meet. He didn't need to say that the benchmark itself was crazy, but just that it existed so they could hang him on it.
Yeah, I mean that there's multiple layers of crazy here. One is, as you're saying, that 6 months as a teenager of hating a certain body part. Again, what's the distinction between that and body dysmorphic disorder? Who knows? But okay, but 6 months is enough to justify removing that body part for life and never being able to get it back. That's ridiculous. But then the fact that they tried to twist that and make it sound like, well, there was a 6-month period in which she did not actively affirm that she loved her body just the way it was. It's like, have you met teenage girls? Have you ever met a teenage girl before? That is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, and she testified to that effect. This idea that after she had her first period, she only ever had 2 periods. It was a little unclear to me why she never had another one if they put her on birth control, because there was all this talk about she didn't like medications. But in any case, she went into hysterics after the sign of womanhood, and then she's going into adolescence. And so it was a question of, is that because you are or should be male that should grow up into a young man, or because you're afraid of womanhood? And she was clear in her testimony that she was extremely uncomfortable with being sexualized, the male gaze, what that means, when you're coming into your own. I haven't had an experience of that. It's like being a gay man, all of a sudden, like, you turn 18 and you're like, "Oh, I'm a sex object. Oh my God, that's a transition, a different kind of one." So, that was certainly a key part of the case.
And again, it's like all of these things that are just such normal struggles for adolescent girls being pathologized as an indicator that they're not meant to be girls, rather than just providing these girls alternative, more accurate and helpful narratives. I wanted to ask you some questions based on your article and some questions based on what people want to ask you on X if there's time. So we should probably at least get to sort of the resolution of the trial. Anything else you want to say about the trial itself before we move on to those questions?
Well, one day I talked to Carleen Grable. I might be butchering her name a little bit, but she's an academic in Australia, and she's written some papers about the impact of having these mastectomies for young women and how devastating it can be when they change their minds about it. And one thing she said to me was, this young woman, she was 16 at the time, she very well could have 30 years ahead of her during which she could be fertile and give birth. And everybody's asking her on the stand, do you want to have kids? She's like, I don't know. I'm 22. But, just in my own life, so I had cancer when I started when I was 43, had surgery, and then I had a recurrence, so it meant I had to have chemotherapy. I'm 43 years old. I've never wanted kids, but it's this question of, do you want to preserve your fertility? And I did it. It's very embarrassing for men. Let me just say, you can't just take a needle and pull things out. But, it's also very expensive. But I just said to myself, I still don't know. I'm 43 years old. So I spent thousands of dollars to freeze that stuff for the next 10 years. I'm looking at 16-year-old girls making this decision. So that to me puts a real personal layer on this.
And again, I would point to the question, what evidence do we have that teenagers are able to accurately predict whether they will want children? There's just no evidence for that. And somehow when gender comes into the picture, it's like we all lose our common sense and we think that, oh, well, there's this third category of person called trans, and a completely different set of rules applies to them. They're not human like the rest of us and subject to making mistakes.
So ultimately, the jury was presented with, I think, 21 questions. Some of them were dependent on one another. And here is how they answered. So, did Dr. Einhorn depart from the good and accepted standards of psychological care in his discussions with the plaintiff about her gender identity? They said yes, and that was unanimous, all six of them. And they said that his departure from that standard indeed was a substantial factor in causing her injuries and pain and suffering. So I'll abbreviate the sort of lengthy sentences in the rest of this. So did he depart from the standard of care by not ensuring that she received that specialized transgender medical support before he wrote the letter? They said yes, but it wasn't unanimous, which meant that only five of them voted for it. But they said that that wasn't a substantial factor in causing her injury, which meant that four or fewer of them voted yes, or none of them voted yes. Or it was not unanimous, so it was somewhere between like one and four. Next, did Dr. Einhorn depart from the standard of care by not obtaining the notes from the Pride Center? They said yes unanimously, but that they said that that wasn't a substantial factor in causing her injury. Oh, correction. Sorry. It was unanimous, that previous one about her causing her injury. The next question is, did Einhorn depart from the standards of care by not ensuring that Fox received specialized transgender care support? They said yes, that wasn't unanimous, so it meant that five of them voted. But they said that no, that was not a substantial factor in causing her injury, and that was a unanimous vote. So next, did he depart from the standard of care by not obtaining the notes from the Pride Center? They said yes, unanimously, but they said no unanimously, that it was not a substantial factor in causing her injury. And then did he depart from standard of care by writing the letter on the day that he did, and in October 2019? They said yes, not unanimously, and that it was a substantial factor causing her injury. They said yes, unanimously. Next, did he depart by writing the letter on the day that he did? Yes, unanimously. And was that a substantial factor causing her injury? Yes, unanimously. Did he depart by not collaborating with Dr. Chin? Yes, unanimously. It caused her injury. Unanimously, yes. Did he depart by not discussing the potential psychological risks of top surgery? No, unanimously. So that struck that one out. Did he depart from the standard by not notifying Dr. Chin that the father, the estranged father of Fox Varian, did not consent to the top surgery? No, not unanimously. Did Dr. Chin depart from the good and accepted standards of care for surgery by not communicating directly with Dr. Einhorn prior to surgery? Yes, unanimously. Was that a substantial factor in causing injury? Yes, unanimously. Therefore, the fact that he didn't call Einhorn sunk him. Then Dr. Chin, did he depart from the standard of care by performing top surgery on the day that he did in mid-December, as opposed to later? Yes, unanimously. And yes, unanimously, that caused her injury. And lastly, this question was reversed. Before he obtained consent on behalf of Fox Varian prior to her surgery, did he provide her with appropriate information? Yes, unanimously. That was it.
Interesting. I was most struck by the fact that they said no to the question of whether the psychologist departed from the standards of care by not discussing the psychological risks of surgery.
Indeed, it's possible what they were saying is that there was an argument between the lawyers that so long as somebody provided discussion about the psychological risks of surgery, it didn't matter who did it. They could complementarily have provided all of this informed consent. As long as you got it somehow, that was fine. It's possible that they believed that Dr. Chin kind of covered it and that was okay. So I'm not really sure of their reasoning.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, he did talk about various psychological implications, but I think the implication from Deutsch, the plaintiff's attorney, was that he didn't go into enough depth about potential risks and really, grind into it and say, "Are you sure you're not going to regret this? This might not be a panacea. This might not solve your problems the way you think." It depended on, like, the level of depth that he was getting into. I think maybe they said, "Well, okay, he only went 2 feet deep as opposed to 4, but we think that was okay." I don't know. It's not impossible to know because I did ask the jurors, they're filing out. They've been there 3 weeks. They wanna get out of there. "Anybody wanna talk to the press?" And they were just like they didn't even say no. They just didn't answer. I'm like, "Okay, so no." So I never got to talk to them.
The impression I got from reading your article in the Free Press and from speaking with you today is that the psychologist's position towards Fox Varian and her mother was very much, this is going to make you feel better. This is right.
In many ways, he would refer to all these different domains, your feelings about your body, your ability to relate to other people, and your depression, anxiety. This is going to help. I don't think he went to the level of panacea saying you will never have any problems again, but he would say, like, once we have this surgery, this problem will be better. You'll see. And she really bought into that. And two things are merging here. Kid comes in with an idea and the adult is affirming it. And so the question was it his responsibility not to merge with her so intensely? And she really said, "Yes, I looked up to him. Yes, I saw him as an authority figure. Yes, he gave me tacit approval." And Einhorn made a big mistake on the stand. So when prompted by Deutsch, who asked Einhorn on the stand whether he needed to have chosen his words wisely, the psychologist essentially put into plain language the very argument against him, the crux of the case. He said, quote, "A lot of times in therapy, kids have plans that maybe are not in their best interest. And you have to be careful to make sure that you're not just giving tacit approval." So there you had it. I mean, he spelled out the case against him very neatly.
Yeah, and as a therapist, I can remember so many moments in my career. No, not so many. I can remember a few moments. I don't want to overestimate that. Where a patient said to me something about, like, "I took your advice and I did blah, 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 blah." And I remember thinking, I that wasn't my advice. We talked about that, and I used therapeutic techniques like reflective listening to help you in your thought process, right? Like, I'm amplifying and reflecting the patient's perspective so they can hear themselves. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm saying I personally, Stephanie Wynn, think that this is a good idea and it's what you should do with my therapeutic stamp of approval, and but the way that patients took it, so and I understand that even with people a lot more mature than a 16-year-old, and then it's that much trickier with teenagers. Add in the fact that this girl was estranged from her father, and both the therapist and the surgeon were men, and she was getting that attention from them. And, hearing that shift about how she presented as more certain about the gender in therapy with her therapist and then less certain when she went to the gender clinic, which is kind of not what you'd expect, that makes me wonder. And it's just a speculation, but it makes me wonder how much it was her experience that clinging rigidly to this, "I'm this special trans kid with gender dysphoria, and you have to, help me convince my mom to get surgery." Like, how much clinging to that in her transference and her therapeutic relationship with the therapist was, something she learned would get attention from him, that maybe she worried that if she didn't have this problem or if she didn't express it this way, that he might not have felt that fond, special attention that he was giving her. And I have no way of knowing, but there's all kinds of things that can happen in the therapeutic relationship.
I think that nuance didn't come up specifically, but that she did indeed look up to him. And then, I'm not at all saying that, you have any problems in being a therapist, but it must be sort of difficult what you're saying. You ask yourself, even though I know I'm practicing all of these methods to not give tacit approval, is there some way in which I nevertheless am being perceived that way? So I'd wonder, how difficult is that for you to try to tease that out? And I have that as a reporter. Well, I never told you what my political stance was on anything. I'm like, oh, we can tell by the way the words you choose and the things you do and also do not say, for example, what you choose to highlight. So in the trial, one example that Deutsch gave was, let's say your patient wants to go rob a bank. He says, I'm thinking rob a bank. At first, you're not going to say, don't rob the bank. You're going to say, why would you like to rob a bank? Is it to do with your finances? We discuss that. What are the pros and cons of robbing a bank? And then let's say, you get to a point where your client's saying, I'm going to rob a bank on Tuesday at 4 and I have a gun, that's different.
I'm thinking also about the therapist's countertransference, the therapist's perception of the patient. And when you described to me, Benjamin, how the therapist seemed to speak with such conviction about this is going to solve your problems and your whole life is going to get better. I mean, of course, it sounds like wildly irresponsible to do that, but it makes me wonder too, like, what was the therapist feeling toward the patient? Because we have our own feelings as therapists. We can get quite frustrated with our patients. We can feel
Mhm.
helpless, especially when a patient is someone who feels very helpless and vulnerable. It's easy for us to get pulled in and for us to also feel helpless and vulnerable, especially if we end up kind of getting unconsciously into a dynamic where we're the expert or we're the problem solver or we're the one who's supposed to make it all better. And then we don't make it better and their distress triggers something in us. Like, I wonder how much he was clinging to this external, idealized gender care as like, "Oh, that'll make the patient better because I can't make the patient better because 'cause I'm feeling out of control about how helpless I feel to help her," or I just wonder what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that element didn't really come up. I saw a Freudian analyst for 6.5 years, 850 times. So I know that's controversial. It worked for me. I don't know if it was a causal effect, but I'm better now than before. So, but there was this period where he's just like, basically, that I didn't have very strong transference. Like, I wasn't like in love with him or obsessed with him. And I was like, you're fine. And this is like a problem. So I remember him once flipping out at me because I would not stop complaining about certain friends of mine that were annoying me, and he, like, just we finally got lost it one day, in any case. So back to the subject at hand. So it's unclear. So, but I think what was clearly established was that Einhorn was out of his depth, and, he made it very clear that it was emotionally devastating for him to be there on the stand and to have this mother and daughter to be that angry with him, and his demeanor throughout the entire trial was just he was just stricken. They'd be talking about him, lambasting him for all these mistakes he made and the consequences to this young woman's entire life. His face would be red. He'd be staring, either straight down or sort of at this downward angle, his hands in his lap, almost as if he were praying, in sort of rueful rumination and regret. And there was this very key moment where the mother gets off the stand after, devastating testimony about what this man, had done to her family, for her words. She walked up and she walked over to where he was sitting in the seating area and glared at him as if to send just daggers through his body with a rage at this man. And he quite literally could not face her. And during a lot of the testimony, he wasn't looking at the stand, which was just right off of maybe a 15-degree angle away from his center eye line. He would look straight ahead or down. He quite literally couldn't face them. Whereas Chin was very elegant and sort of imperious and unflappable, and despite the fact that Deutsch is 6'7" and this big attack dog, still managed to peer down his nose at Deutsch under cross-examination by sort of catching in on things that he was doing that were wrong or that he was meandering or stumbling or something. And so, he came in, he went to Harvard, he was the top 10% of his class, he trained in Vanderbilt, and I think it was Yale, he did training again at NYU and at University of Washington. They were all the best programs. This guy was like the top notch, and I I just personally would argue that it was not in his best interest to dress as elegantly as he did, because it made him come across as sort of this elitist and removed from reality, if nothing else. Whereas Einhorn was quite sort of, he looked like the absent-minded professor. He was wearing one of those jackets with the patches on the elbows one day, and he wore like these sort of work boots as opposed to dress shoes. So I thought their sartorial choices were an experiment in contrast as well as their personality. But I was sitting right behind Chin during the verdict, and then Einhorn was always right off to my left. And by that point, this was no surprise. For one thing, a jury had asked a question about an hour prior about the precise allocations of or the amounts they might give for the award. So we already knew that she had won. So this wasn't a crashing surprise at that exact moment. But, Chin looked sort of still unflappable. And the thing is, there's reputational damage, and now his name is being put in all these articles. And the way you're going to Google him for at least quite some time, it'll probably come up. But their insurance pays for it, and he was only ultimately 30% responsible for the ultimate award. His idea that he was 30% responsible for the damages, therefore that he pays 30% of the $2 million, and it's his insurance company. So, it's not like they don't shell out for it. But, I think especially for Einhorn, it was clear that he found this deeply chastening and humiliating. And speaking of regret, he looked very regretful. He didn't say so. This is my observation, my opinion, just from observing him. And it was also awkward because I'm trying not to become a part of the trial, but you know, some an object being observed is changed by the fact that you're observing it. That old saying. And I would imagine that he could tell that I kept looking over and being like, is he doing anything that I might take note of, and that my doing so might make him behave in a certain way. So that was a bit of an awkward dynamic.
It's interesting because I'm hearing from you that he felt humiliated and maybe
Evidently, I would say evidently. I don't know
yeah.
that he expressed deep regret about facing a family that was very angry with him, and he had treated her for, about 3.5 years, so they had a very intimate relationship. So, speaking of transference, that, he made clear that that was very painful.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the tension between his actual feelings and his defense strategy because if
Yes.
he felt anything like you imagine he felt, his personal inclination might have been to say, "You're right, I'm sorry, I'm guilty, what's my punishment?" But I wonder if that would have had legal repercussions for him that were like, because I mean, a lot of people in the gender critical community, as I'm sure you're well aware, want people to lose their licenses and want people to go to prison, and that was not on trial. Nobody lost their license here, nobody was facing jail time. This was about, financial punishment, and you're saying it's being covered by their, malpractice insurance. But I wonder, like, if he felt some moral tension between expressing his true feelings of humiliation and remorse, and the fact that he kinda still needs to preserve his, livelihood.
One can speculate, I would imagine so. But again, this is me just as an armchair lawyer. And that would be a bad defense strategy if you said, yes, I feel terrible. I messed up. That's a great way to lose a lawsuit. So
Right, right. Wow. Okay. Well, do you have time for some questions from X? Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over the top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETHERAPIST to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETHERAPIST at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. Question from Dr. Travis Morrell, who I mentioned earlier has been on this show, and I would recommend that episode to anyone who missed it. So he asks, is this malpractice because of cutting off breasts of a teen, or malpractice because of some technicality, like not putting something on the printed informed consent? And if the latter, is it something likely to apply to many, many cases, say a mistruth like the suicide lie?
well, I mean, to the first question, it's the latter. We're not asking whether you should, in any case, remove somebody's breasts for gender dysphoria, but if in this case the standards of care weren't followed. So I've talked to psychologists, Eric Anderson for one, and Laura Edwards Leeper, you mentioned, and Amy Tishelman, and they're all people who were leadership in WPATH who have been dissidents and critics of it from within, saying that ultimately this field has become sloppy, to use Eric Anderson's very famous words from an interview with Abigail Schreier in 2021. So they say that hopefully this will lead to more cautious practices, more intense assessments, more careful exploration with kids about their gender identity. But it's not going to undo the entire field per se, unless that's through extremely expensive malpractice premiums and fear of reputational damage, and nobody wants to practice within this kind of a minefield. But it's not going to make invalid the WPATH guidelines. Let's just say.
Although the WPATH guidelines weren't that much of a help here. Like, they didn't
They were
cover
just
anyone.
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of a non-presence. They were in the air, but also they weren't admitted into evidence either. So that was tricky whenever they were trying to ask about it, that there would be lots of injections that would get sustained, because the standards of care, big S, big C, from WPATH weren't actually as a part of the evidence. So they couldn't be that specific about the words in them either.
Okay, I have a good question from Jonathan Cogburn, who's also been on my show. He says, out of the other current open lawsuits, which one do you, Ben, expect to be helped the most by the Varian case, if at all?
A lot of them run into statute of limitation problems, so that's really the barrier. They can be very strict in certain states, and so the Joanna Olson-Kennedy one, Clementine Breen, she filed her lawsuit very promptly. She started to detransition. She was 19. She filed when she was 20, I believe, and I don't know the exact specifics of the law in California, but whatever the case is, the judge decided that the clock started when she was 13, when she started testosterone, at the date of injury, not at the date of realizing the injury or like a certain period of time after turning 18. So she had long since run out. I guess it was 2 or 3 years after age 13 before by the time she filed. So there's that problem. It's hard to say. I mean, all juries are going to be different, but I think that lawyers will certainly look at this as a roadmap of types of strategies to look into, where, are they meeting the standard of care? How do you define it? So it's really hard to say, but they're pretty similar. So I think that if nothing else, it's going to embolden other lawyers to maybe enter the space to feel a bit more confident. What's really happened is we have these diehards who have filed these initial cases for the most part. I don't include Adam Deutsch in this case. He's just a personal injury attorney in White Plains, so not specialized in this type of lawsuit per se. Whereas we have Campbell Miller Payne. So there are these four white shoe lawyers. They all got together. They started a law firm for the only purpose of going after people on behalf of detransitioners. So they're really leading the charge in that regard, and they're kind of testing the waters. And there are some other places that are doing this as well, different law firms, but other law firms might be looking at this and saying, is this something that we want to risk all that time and money? And if they see that there's a promise there, then they might be more interested in getting in. But then we might see some more, frankly, unscrupulous cases by the ambulance chaser types in that case, that maybe the cases aren't as strong and they're just looking for money. But this case in particular, Bavarian, was much cleaner. There weren't politics involved. No one could accuse her of being some sort of plant for the Republican Party. Politics never came up. Whether I think Chloe Cole's case is going to be a lot harder because they're going to be going after her. Aren't you just doing this for political reasons? You're doing this for fame. You're doing this for money. You've given 4,000 interviews we can hang you on. Whereas for Fox Varian, there were exactly no interviews. She'd never spoken about this publicly. That makes it a lot easier for her lawyer. Whereas somebody was posting on X today about something that Joanna Olson-Kennedy had said. I can't remember what it was, but she said something where someone had said like things your lawyer are really angry that you said in public. Where I would think it was when that line from, I think it was from Jesse Single's piece in the Atlantic in 2018. Where she was downplaying assessments and saying she didn't think they were worth anything. So there's those corner cases, I think, are going to be able to draw in, publicity, past publicity in the ways that this case absolutely could not.
Okay. In that same post, Jonathan also asks, which cases do you think have the best chances of success?
I think that's impossible to say. Just period. I mean, they're all taking a risk.
Okay, here's one you've already answered from my friend Julia Mason. Did a WPATH associated surgeon testify against the plastic surgeon or in support?
Yeah. Yeah, it was flipped. The guy who was testifying on behalf of the defense wasn't involved in WPATH, and his authority was undermined by his lack of experience with WPATH and with publishing academically in this field.
Epistemic asks, what arguments did the jury seem to find most compelling? What mistakes may have been made by the legal teams? Was any significant evidence excluded for legal reasons?
Significant evidence, well, I guess centers of care. I thought it was strange that they didn't talk about what you'd seen in the deposition about the difference that the mother made between what she saw is sort of like less serious threats of suicide from her daughter being thrown around and that and what she heard from Einhorn. So strangely enough, that no one ever made that distinction. It's possible they just forgot, but it's also possible that for some reason they weren't allowed to go down that avenue. I'm not sure. It's hard to know. We read out all the jury questions, so we know how they answered. We don't really know why. They were totally impassive. The only read I got from any of them was that the woman who I knew would be the forewoman, she looked like this the entire time. She was listening, and she wasn't just a pose either. And you could tell she really wanted to be fair. Like I just read that on her face so clearly. And there was this other woman who just wanted to die. She had her hair on her face. She was half asleep the whole time. And everybody else, I couldn't tell at all. So, who knows? There were nobody cried. There are some jokes every now and then, people laugh, but like nothing big. Got no read on them.
Well, that actually connects to our next question from Anonymom. Was there a moment in the trial when Ben felt the jury had been won over to the young woman's side?
You couldn't tell. I can tell you that the mother's testimony was devastated me. I even like tearing up. Like I was like a wreck. And I was trying to keep myself composed because there were so few people in the court, and the judge was kind of after me to make sure I didn't do anything that would disrupt the trial. And if I knew that I'd be sitting there like sobbing, they'd throw me out. So, I ran in the bathroom and like just like lost it because it was really devastating. A mother who felt that she had done everything for her child and had trusted someone and that trust had been violated, to be that let down, and to have that cost on her child forever. She expressed that so powerfully. And, we hear these suicide threats thrown around all the time online by doctors, by Olson-Kennedy. And we know that they're not necessarily backed up by sound research. And here we were in the flesh live in front of me, hearing the cost of those threats, and that's what I'd like to say to people. There's this trans woman named Julie Ray Goldstein, who's always on Blue Sky, dismissing all these cases as all being just flagrant abuses of the legal system, that kind of thing. And, she never takes seriously any of the claims to sympathy of any of the plaintiffs in these cases. They're all just political pawns. And, I'd really like to say to Julia, I would like you to sit there in court and listen to this woman and see the distress in her face and to ask yourself whether you're really being fair in the same way that she would ask of me, like, are you being fair to all the young people who would be helped by this? Are you just over focusing on rare exceptions, and having that sort of destroy the whole narrative and all the legal landscape that would permit these treatments for other people? So, these are, I think, fair questions, but it troubles me how absolutist trans activists are about this. And frankly, it's clearly a losing strategy, which is not to say necessarily that I think that the right wing wouldn't have come after this field regardless of what trans activists had done, but they won't give an inch if it's on, trans girls' inclusion in girls' sports, or it's like minors absolutely have to have this surgery. And they'll, no one will ever say, well, why do they have to do it now? Couldn't she have waited 18 months till she was 18? What was the rush? Is she literally gonna die in that period of time? So that was, the argument by the defense. How was the mother to know that she might not have killed herself? And this idea of an absence that doing nothing is not a neutral act, you hear that all the time. And I always have a problem with that, just logically saying, I don't know about, okay, theoretically, yes, but in medicine, when you propose an intervention, the onus is on you as let's say an advocate of that intervention to prove that it's safe and effective. And it's a balance of risks and benefits favorable to the patient. It's not, the onus is not on people who think that you either shouldn't have it or just have questions about it to prove that not doing it is better. That's not how this works, like quite literally.
All right, a few more questions. David Atkinson asks, what are the lessons for both sides regarding future detrans lawsuits?
Clearly what was very effective by Deutsch was hanging them on their own words. And if nothing else, he had a very solid and slick presentation in his closing argument. He had one slide after another in which he hung them on their words, and the real crucial parts were in red, and he went through one after another, and you could see it because it's hard to remember. You've had all this information just thrown at you. I was having so much trouble keeping everything straight in my notes. I had hundreds of pages of notes. Like, oh yeah, he did say that. So to have it refresh in your memory, blow after blow, and like, oh, you're right. They did hang themselves. Whereas the defense is just trying to nibble around the edges. Oh, Erica Anderson changed her story about whether she had gender dysphoria between the affidavit and her time in the stand. That meant she lied under oath. You're like, well, it's as she said, she got new information. It reminds you of COVID, like we found out new information, we changed our story. We should have done a better job of saying in the first place that we weren't sure, but that's normal. That's part of science, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if the defense could have had a better strategy, but their closing was very weak. And the only time they really brought in the larger philosophical question of kids should receive this was in the closing. Neil Kornfeld, the defense attorney, said, "There's an elephant in the room." And then he put up a slide of an elephant in a room, which was a little corny. And it's this idea, which you said came up in jury selection, which I was not permitted to attend. And I didn't know about this, but, one of the potential jurors had said, like, should they be giving this to kids? So he finally acknowledged that larger question, then that might influence their decision making, like it or not, unconscious bias, that sort of thing. But Deutsch, I think very successfully just slammed them for having a crappy presentation, a lot of gimmicks. Sabrina Sellers, the other defense attorney for Einhorn, she used this big piece of paper where she was writing this thing she called Not Einhorn about things that were the kids doing, and it was your idea to get the binder, and it was your idea to get the surgery, and your idea to change your name. And I didn't know this, but Einhorn said it's an age-old gimmick in defense attorneys will use some sort of prop to get people to look away from the testifying witness. And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know that." Apparently, like, everybody knows this in litigation, but it did seem like a gimmick to me. And also, almost all the things that were on that list, were reversible. You can grow your hair, you can change your clothes back, whatever you want. You can change your name again, you know, except for the surgery. This was about the surgery. All those other things are kind of immaterial, when it came to does she have her breasts or not? You yes, you can get reconstruction, but you can't breastfeed again. It's expensive. It's difficult. You're going to have breast implants replaced several times in your lifetime. All these things, it's not the same thing. And again, going back to Olson-Kennedy, she very famously said in a leaked video of a training she gave a few years ago, she was training mental health professionals about writing these letters. And I think it was, and this training was for insurance companies' purposes, not necessarily to a doctor. But she got real sassy in this little presentation. And just people were, you're talking about this idea, well, what if they regret it? And she said, I'm trying to get the exact quote. Is if you're disappointed in the end or something, she said, you can go out and get them about breasts. And that's her attitude is you can go out and get them. Okay, so what does that entail? It's expensive, it's difficult, there are risks involved with any surgery. It's not the same thing, and you can't breastfeed. And, she lost some sensation in her nipples. She said she had nerve pain and numbness, but there was a big thing about how that had never been documented by any doctor. So there was no documentation of that. We had to take her word for it. Um, but one of the things she did say, convincingly, is I don't trust doctors given my bad experience with them. Like, well, that's convincing. So she said at least that she does have this pain. So, you can take that at face value or not.
Well, and we know from Prisha Mosley's case what can happen to
Yes.
young women who have their breasts removed and then later have a baby. Prisha has been
Yes.
through a lot of pain and needed a lot of extra medical care because her breasts were trying to lactate but couldn't.
Yeah.
Um, So
She still had some milk ducts, in there, but they not connected to the nipple. So she had breast milk accumulating that couldn't exit her body. She said positively it was very, very painful.
been so hard for her.
Yeah.
Okay. Lisa Anlow asks, I'd be interested to know whether the defense team tried to take cover in referencing guidance from professional organizations such as American Psychological Association. If so, does this type of defense open the door to naming these orgs as additional defendants?
I'm not remembering specifically. I could be getting this wrong, but they might have mentioned them a few times, just sort of like saying in the air that lots of different medical organizations, endorse these types of care. But it wasn't very specific. No one pulled out the 2018 Rafferty statement from the AAP, about the gender affirming care method. Nothing that specific. No.
Okay. She also says, also would like to know if any of these cases involve simultaneously filing complaints to licensing boards. And before you answer that, Ben, I will just say, for those who lack context, it's much, much, much easier to file a complaint to a licensing board. It's free, it's private, it's anonymous, and I have guidance on how to do it on my website. At sometherapist.com/read, there are instructions for how to file a licensing board complaint. So now you can go ahead and answer.
Uh, I'm not aware that there might be. I just don't know.
Okay. BioReality Colorado or BioReality Co. Is there risk of an appeal?
That I don't know.
Okay. And finally, last question. Vance says, isn't this more of a sloppy doctors didn't follow WPATH standards of care more than it is a standards of care shouldn't be honored at all because trans kids don't actually exist?
Technically, yes. So the question is, how many doctors out there are that sloppy? So, you know, is it 5% or is it all? Are there nevertheless people who, at least ostensibly, following the standards of care under WPATH who are still sloppy? So I am not saying one could argue, or one did argue, let's just say, in the case against Joanna Olson-Kennedy argues that she was sloppy, despite being the high princess of WPATH standards of care. So, but she's made very clear that she has her problems both with the DSM definition of gender dysphoria. So on my Substack, I've been publishing. Someone leaked to me like 12 hours of training videos that Olson-Kennedy has given about the gender affirming care method, and she makes it very clear, for example, that she does not believe that distress should be a criterion in the DSM's definition of gender dysphoria. That you don't need that to treat these kids. So she's among those who are advocating to change things like within WPATH to loosen the standards. She's made that very clear. So and I'm not saying that you know I can't tell you for sure whether she was sloppy with Clementine Reed in particular, but we can say, the sequence of things of how they happened. And we can also say that, she has advocated against these types of assessments. So, it's up for a jury to decide whether she indeed was sloppy to the point where, that violated standards of care, provided she meets a jury, because we'll see if they ever win the appeal to get the case actually going forward. So
This will be my last question. Having studied everything that you've studied and having sat in on this case, imagining a future detransitioner lawsuit, maybe one of the other 28, imagining that suit found that the doctors and therapists followed the WPATH standards of care to a T, what do you think that would do for the case? And the plaintiff was still injured.
it would require that they believed and that the expert witnesses, I suppose, also believed that the WPATH standards of care were the legal standards of care, for that the case is supposed to hinge upon that. But yeah, well, let's just say they won that case. I think that would really buttress the standards of care by the WPATH as being, a more legitimate document. One could say, I suppose.
You mean if the defendant won that case?
Right, exactly.
Right. So a lot, I think, hinges in terms of like looking toward the future with all these other detrans lawsuits in process. We don't know how much of a role the WPATH standards of
Yeah.
care will play in those cases, or what version of the standards of care would have applied at that time. As you said, it was 7 at the time, which is what I was trained on and had a lot of questions about at the time. Um, but I think that this is where I'm going to kind of end on a question mark. And maybe you're on that same question mark, because I'm thinking, based on what I've learned from you about Fox Varian's historic victory, as much as WPATH standards of care did not play prominently and weren't followed to a T. I still think that a case like this would have a lot to go on, even if they could demonstrate that the standards of care, the WPATH standards of care, were followed, and this could potentially call into question the validity of WPATH.
Chloe Cole's case could do that, in fact, and lend Kayla Love dolls. So
Okay.
Chloe Cole's is set to go for jury in April of 2027. And there's another one, I'm blanking on her name, that's going in Missouri on August 3rd of this year. It's going to start.
All right. Well, Benjamin Ryan, thank you so much for joining
Thanks for having
me. Tell people where they can find you.
So my Substack is benryan.substack.com, X and Blue Sky. Although I don't know that many of you are using Blue Sky. They're both the same as Ben Ryan Writer, and my website is benryan.net.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.